Good morning, good afternoon, good evening in the now time-honored tradition of the virtual world. I'm delighted to have a chance to moderate this important session on what may be one of the most difficult topics that we face, which is the questions of accountability and handling some of the inevitable failures of accountability. And building on the previous plenary panel, I think we all know that the issues of trust and the issues of human dignity, but in a more concrete sense, human rights are a very vital element in the global response to the pandemic. The topic today is broad. In some senses, I can share with you that there was more than one planned panel that were joined together because of the shift from a planned in person to a virtual environment. So we have a large agenda before us. And what I'm going to do is to ask each of the panelists who come from very different world regions, who have remarkably different backgrounds, to respond to a piece of story that we're facing: the accountability issues, human rights issues, issues of trust, but also some very tangible and concrete issues that are being discussed this week during the major annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, which essentially are mobilizing some of the finance, whether it's debt action or new finance that is needed for communities to address and to cope with the current crisis. So with that very brief introduction, let me turn first to Dr. Al-Rama, who has, I'm not going to do introductions. You have the bios, and that takes too much of our precious time. But I will emphasize that she has had several different hats, and therefore I know has a lot to say. But if she could start perhaps by framing these issues in terms of the human rights and the broader challenges that we face.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Because of our societies being unequal in the first place, the consequences of any crisis, such as the current, has more impact on marginalized and less fortunate groups. For example, because of pre-existing inequality and deep-rooted discrimination against women, this has impacted women more than men, while still placing more responsibilities on women's shoulders. I'm talking economic difficulties, social difficulties, for example. All reports have shown the increase in domestic violence. At the same time, women are struggling between keeping a job to survive and finding childcare. Reports have also shown an increase in violence against children and an increase in hunger around the world, specifically in children. Victims of armed combat, refugees, religious and ethnic minorities. The impact of this crisis, COVID-19, was much harder on those groups than others. Now, this requires governments, especially G20 leaders, religious actors, international organizations, and democratic institutions everywhere to work on national and international human rights commitments. Solidarity today is not a choice or act of charity. It is a must. No one state or one leader can do it alone. This is the time of joint actions. Now, a lot of the women's rights and human rights statements were announced by the different treaty bodies of the Human Rights Council. I believe that COVID-19 has taught us a lot of lessons If we take one lesson, which is inequalities and discriminations among our societies is the challenge. And these issues should be on every government agenda. And we should face them and solve them before we face any crisis. And I believe that the G20 leaders and all the religious leaders can play a huge role in solving these issues so we can face any crisis the world or globally we can have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've put the challenge of translating principles and ideals of human rights squarely on the agenda. Let's turn next. Let's move to, I assume you're in Thailand, to Sambaum, who has, again, a number of different hats. One of them being the head of a rather remarkable network of engaged Buddhists, which works across a number of countries. Mu, what are your priorities now? What are you seeing as the major areas that need action for trust and accountability, particularly?
Good evening, Catherine and everyone. Well, while I'm sitting here, you know that we have over 10,000 people protesting the government in front of the government today, and that the mass protest demonstration today. This happened because of the people are untrust to the main institution in the country right now, which is also, you know, not just only the government, including even with the military, including even a lot of questions to Nagi. That also is a lot of big requests. And even though in Thailand, the government and the people, as well as the civil society, has been managed about the COVID quite well. We have until now only 3,600 cases in the country, that is quite good. But in terms of sharing the helping to the people, that also especially to the poor, that there are a lot of gaps into that. And also, you know, a lot of the faith-based group and also the civil society has been helped the government. A lot of things that the government cannot do by themselves. This is also come up to the accountability in terms of during the crisis. And Thailand has been passing through different crises, but this time also is quite big. Everything is come together and have a big questions to the main institution in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I see on my screen Juan Navarro Floria. So why don't we move to Juan to tell us how you see these issues of accountability and trust in Argentina, where you're sitting. What happened to Juan?
He has been disconnected, Professor. So in case you refer the question to another colleague in the panel.
Okay, well, let's turn then to Ruth Messenger, who I have seen, who is sitting in New York, I presume. Ruth, you have been the head of a rather remarkable and unusual faith-inspired organization, the American Jewish World Service, but you also have a long career in the political arena and in others. How does the organization, but also how do you personally see some of the priorities for moving ahead in reflecting on trust and accountability?
So I'm very moved, Catherine, by what several of the previous speakers have said. And I think I have to frame this personally. I guess it's my mood right now, but a piece of my mood is government so often disappoints. So this is a moment, and I heard the opening plenary before ours. You know, so many people start with the assumption of there's a world pandemic, everybody will respond and help everybody who's sick. And we already know that that's not true. And the people in the early plenary talked about all of the systemic inequities. But the one we have to focus on now is that governments too often do not rise to the occasion. And I'm speaking, as the panelists know, from the United States, which has definitely not risen to the occasion and has terrible numbers. But what happens is when government doesn't respond well, just through even ineptitude, people lose trust in their government. Governments don't want to be held accountable for what they are or are not doing. That is certainly true in the United States right now. And then there's one whole other issue, which is very important to me because it's core to the way American Jewish World Service works. We never, in the countries in which we work, we never focus simply on service. We focus on the movement of people toward their own visions of justice, which means full realization of human rights. And we now see in country after country that the pandemic is almost being used as an excuse to deny one group their human rights or to favor one group over another or to do things that may enhance the lives and the livelihoods of a few people in government, but undermine trust in government and mean that so many different groups, whether defined ethnically or by sexual orientation or by gender, are discriminated against by their own governments, sometimes, as I said, through ineptitude, but also sometimes deliberately through the government playing favorites. And what that does is sap whatever faith people have in government, and it makes the work, which is really what we're talking about here, makes the work of faith-based organizations that much more critical. I would just say quickly that we cannot, as faith institutions or faith-based organizations, simply drill down narrowly and do the immediate work that needs to be done. We need to look at the role that governments are playing, occasionally the positive role, but more often the disruptive, corrupt role. And we need to work with people on the ground through our faith-based institutions to do more to expand human rights and hold governments accountable.
Excellent. Let's go back and see if we can hear from Juan Navarro-Floria and how you see, sitting in Argentina, some of these issues of trust and accountability, also facing remarkable political challenges and as well as economic and social. Where do the religious actors come in, and how do you see the issues emerging there?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good day. First of all, I'd like to say the G20 Forum conducted in the last few months regional consultation on several of the issues discussed in the G20 this year, and one of them was, of course, the response of the religions to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see the conclusions of that discussion and the proposal we have made to governments on the Interfaith Forum website. At this moment, I think that Latin America has the sad privilege to contributing half of the infected in the all over the world. Some of our countries like Brazil and are among the most affected in the world. And across the continent, the pandemic has exposed some structural problems that existed before, but are now, enormous inequality in our countries. Latin America is the most unequal region of the world. And Europe has not access to clean water, to minimal sanitary conditions, to decent work and healthcare. Historical, also now, the governments have not been able to provide the minimum services to signal population. In this context, religions play a very important role. In Latin America, there are a dominant presence of the Roman Catholic Church for historical reasons, but in recent decades, The presence of other religions has also grown, in particular churches of the very diverse of the denominations, some from abroad and others born in Latin America. And there are another, of course, religions like Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others, and in some places a significance of Islam and Judaism. And the characteristic of Latin America is, and very especially in my country, Argentina, is the peaceful and the collaboration and dialogue between the different religious communities. In the pandemic, except for very isolated and minority cases, these were an example of solidarity in several ways. In the first place, they placed themselves in the same line, governments recommending to the faithful to comply with the sanitary measures, the same experience that shared with us the Ministry of Iraq earlier today. But the religious communities activated their extensive solidarity networks put at the service of the most vulnerable places to be kept, volunteers, health and food aid. And in Latin America, churches reach places and people where the state is. Some of those humanitarian initiatives were also interfaith. The most important assistance network organized in Argentina was Interreligious, led by the Catholic Church, but along with the Evangelical Church, the Jewish community groups. I think that to make such action more effective and provide a better organization for the social assistance in the pandemic, it will be necessary to institutionalize mechanisms for dialogue and consultation, which not always exist between the state and with religious communities. These mechanisms, such as advisory councils, would also allow a better understanding by states of the needs of communities, because during the pandemic and still today in Latin America, religious freedom has been seriously damaged, imposing unnecessary and excessive restrictions to the activity of religious communities. Not only religious gatherings, sometimes totally and completely, has been prevented, but also religious assistance to the sick and dying was prevented. While public health care is legislative for restricting external manifestations of religious freedom, the harsh way in which that is being done in many places is a violation of international human rights treaties. I strongly share what Elder Bettner said today early in the plenary. If the usual relationship between states and religious communities is organized through cooperation, it's also possible that there will be better control for the destination of funds and goods dedicated to a more efficient allocation of resources by the participation of religious leaders who are in direct contact with the people who need that help, and thus some control the deviation of corruption sadly very often present in our countries. There are another point that I only mentioned due to lack of time, but which is the contribution of communities to bioethics committees, both nationally and other levels, and even hospital, because they force difficult decisions to be made in this area, and the compassionate vision of religious community is much needed. This is my first thank you.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. Let's turn now to Europe, to Jonatas Machado. You also have, I think, an extraordinary and rather unique perspective, both from an academic point of view and a practical one. And the Europe consultation focused a great deal on these issues. Perhaps you could situate and comment on how you see these broad issues of accountability, as well as some of their more practical dimensions.
Thank you very much, Catherine. First of all, as an international law professor and human rights professor, I I would stress that religious communities can either be part of the solution or part of the problem, and they have to make some choices concerning that point. Some religious communities really responded very actively and proactively and very successfully and relevantly to the COVID-19 challenge, helping with food, with clothing, with ventilators, with personal protection equipment. In Lisbon, for instance, the mosque of Lisbon received more, almost 200 asylum seekers and migrants infected with COVID while it was closed to the public, to its own members. So there was a very important response from religious communities. And I think this interfaith dialogue is really very important, and is very important also with the secular sectors of the society. It's important that religious communities humbly understand that they could be part of the solution, but unfortunately, sometimes they are part of the problem. And they are part of the problem when, for instance, they come with very simplistic theological reasons for the COVID. When they engage in competitive prophesizing, each one trying to come up with the best prophetic word about this COVID crisis, trying to score some theological points, saying that the COVID is the punishment for this and for that. So it's important for the religious communities to humbly recognize that they may have a role to play, but they should play together and in a humble spirit. And the same goes for states and governments. A course of action that emphasizes, my nation first, my government first, my community first, or my religious community first is really not the best option. Now we should stress the value of interdependent sovereignty and not just national sovereignty. Interdependent sovereignty means multilateralism, dialogue, the participation in the United Nations, in the World Trade Organization, in the World Health Organization, in the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, using these institutions as a means of promoting dialogue and cooperation between states. Because if one state starts my state first, the other will also do claim my state first, and then we will have nationalism and rivalry and conflicts, and who knows, even war. History is full of examples of that, and so we should get away from this. Another aspect important is really the need to have policies that include people. The COVID-19 has shown that people are vulnerable. Even those who live in very rich countries, if they don't have universal health care, for instance, they can see themselves in very dramatic situations. And of course, we should not forget those that are really vulnerable, those migrants, asylum seekers, in several countries like Syria, like Libya, like Yemen, like Nagorno-Karabakh, Tibet, and things like that. Other countries that really need our engagement. And as far as Europe is concerned, the will of the European Union is really to promote this idea of interdependent sovereignty, dialogue, multilateralism, as opposed to the old nationalism that really is the source of, has been the source of many deaths, countless deaths, with no purpose at all. Another last point is of anti-corruption and integrity and accountability and good governance. This idea has been promoted by the United Nations since Kofi Annan promoted the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and there are other multilateral issues here. And we should not forget that the COVID-19 has increased the possibilities of corruption when we see these large transfers of money from the public sector to the pharmaceutical sector to these rescue packages with lots of trillions of euros of dollars being disseminated around. There we need transparency, accountability, and we also need the civil society to monitor. And religious communities are important here, but they have also to do their own work and be transparent in themselves and compliant and really live up to the standards of integrity and transparency that they themselves want to promote.
Great, thank you. Let's turn now to Canon Sarah Snyder, who has in her title the vital and important word reconciliation. And you are dealing, I think, particularly with some of the most persistent and complex conflict areas in the world. How do you see this path to restoration of trust with the dimension of accountability? Where does that fit into the work that you're doing now?
Thank you, Catherine. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Firstly, just to touch on that word reconciliation, which I think an easier understanding of the word is healing what is broken. And we are seeing so much that is broken and fractured during this COVID pandemic. And the team of reconciliation is really trying to address those fractures through engaging faith actors and all actors in the healing of the brokenness they see around them. But I really wanted to pick up on the theme of corruption that the last panelist mentioned, because it seems that societies with widespread corruption correlate with high levels of religiosity. And I was wondering why that is. We differ internationally in how we even understand, let alone limit, corruption. Nepotism, for example, can appear corrupt for some, while for others it's morally acceptable, trusting kinship loyalty or individual meritocracy. So the impact of religion on attitudes towards moral behaviour is not clear-cut. Sometimes religious communities share a united position on issues, and sometimes they don't. People are influenced by social norms and conventions, religious guidelines, and other concepts, such as, in our current COVID climate, prevailing attitudes around the purpose of protection of livelihoods. And indeed, our individual and our community's values are framed by different or clashing worldviews, including those that straddle religious, cultural, and secular opinion. Learn, for example, in the home that obeying our elders is important, whilst witnessing among peers that not all elders can be trusted. One might learn at our places of worship that obedience takes precedence, whilst realizing our political or institutional leaders are not themselves God-fearing. When faced with the demand to obey an elder in a particular context, like COVID-related restrictions, what do we do and who do we turn to for advice? We're regularly confronted by conflicting values, and that's most evident perhaps when faced with the primary conflict between our responsibilities towards others and the need to look after ourselves, individual rights. It's helpful, therefore, to identify the social, educational, and other messages that people receive within their religious communities as well as outside them, and to identify possible sources of value conflict concerning corruption and other messaging. So the messages individuals receive about whether a particular attitude or behavior is moral or immoral may also be conflicting. How we interpret and act on those messages is important. We discuss or observe these value conflicts within our multiple communities, our family, our friends, our religious community, our work, our education, and so on. Corruption should, one concludes, be easier to challenge when societal messages consistently consistent with religious men. Religious teaching themselves seems to have very little influence on attitudes towards corruption. Rather, it's the socialization of religious actors that plays a more significant role. Hence, the influence of religion lies less in what sacred texts say than in how interpreters, clerics, and others interpret them, and how their relevance to collective social behavior is understood. This will seem obvious to those of us embedded within religious community, but it's not always clear-cut to those who research the impact of religion and religious leaders on human behavior. So finally, in religious community where critical thinking is valued and modeled within educational settings, moral reasoning can play an important role in communal decision-making and action. Community members are then better equipped to apply the teaching of their religious tradition to actual solutions for specific challenges faced in real life, even when factors like prejudice, authority, or the moral majority try to prevent us from acting according to our moral conscience. Religious and ethical education needs to teach such critical thinking skills without fear that they somehow diminish or compromise the essence of our religious belief. Religious leaders and educators are encouraged to teach their followers to apply moral lessons and norms to specific experiences, rather than simply to teach moral content. Scriptural reasoning is just one methodology that enables this within a practicing religious context. So do look at scripturalreasoning.org if you can for more details of this incredible, simple, but effective practice. I'll stop there, Catherine. I'm sure time's up.
Turn to Bishop Kuka from one of the most complex, troubled areas of the world, but also a wonderful community, Sokoto. Bishop Kuka, you have focused a great deal on these issues of trust, accountability, and particularly corruption. How do you see this as a priority and as an avenue for action?
Excuse me, Bishop Kuka, could you please unmute your microphone? We can't hear you. Please unmute your microphone. Bishop Kuka, I'm sorry for interrupting. We can't hear you. Could you please unmute your microphone?
Sorry.
Now we can hear you. Perfect.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I've just done that. I'm very sorry.
Perfect.
First of all, I was extended my apology for coming in late. I got quite a bit of problem, but thank God I finally resolved them. I was just making the point made by the last speaker, which I thought was very interesting, namely this sort of corruption living side by, living side by side with religiosity. And just as an aside, my experience in Nigeria here suggests very clearly that when systems don't work and a state is dysfunctional, and the bureaucracy and other service delivery agencies don't work, and the political class cannot be trusted, increasingly when people are not secure in their homes and can't trust the security agencies, the tendency to turn towards God is always very, very strong. But having said that, my comment about what has happened in our situation here in Nigeria is, first of all, we were caught unawares, and nobody really was prepared for COVID-19. But in an environment such as ours, where even at the very beginning, we had poor quality service delivery systems relating to health, where poverty was quite endemic and corruption was very, very strong. It was almost natural that dealing with the issues of COVID-19 would also be caught in this web. But from the religious point of view, I think for me, as a Catholic, let me start off on that point, is that looking at the history, the church had always responded favorably by virtue of its gospel, the teachings of Jesus Christ regarding to neighbors. holiness, gospel of love, and coming to people who are, coming to people's assistance in times of aid and so on. So in a way, you can argue that over time, with the pandemic, the various pandemics around the world, the church has always stood side by side with people. So this didn't catch us by surprise, so to say. The only difficulty and challenge that we faced was, as I said, there are severe limitations in terms of infrastructure. I mean, Nigeria, we have a Christian Association of Nigeria, which is the umbrella organization that holds all the Christian communities together. We also have the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, which is the organization that holds the different Muslim groups together. And we have the NIREC, which is a Interreligious Council. But whereas for us as different churches responded to COVID-19 differently. At a national level, there was quite a lot of, we had meetings, we have tried to develop strategies as to how to respond to this crisis nationally. And of course, a lot of it was tied down to raising funds and dealing with the different problems. But in our own case, every diocese was allowed to develop its own structure. So the first thing we did was, we already have in the Catholic Church an existing organization called the St. Vincent de Paul Association, which has always been taking care of the weak and vulnerable, even in normal times. So it was very easy to develop our using that already existing platform that has been with many dioceses right across the world for a very long period of time. The first thing, of course, that we had was to put our own house in order. We developed the required protocols in keeping the national body had also released in terms of instructions and so on. But the very first thing we tried to do was to go back to the very vulnerable people in terms of, people that were having problems with shelter, people that were having problems with food, clothing. And, the response was enormous because we didn't have a situation in which parishioners were simply sitting and waiting for the bishop or waiting for their. We made appeals and people came very, very quickly to people responded quite favorably. So we didn't know how long this was going to last for. And as a result, it was very difficult for people to plan. But the first thing we did was to make sure that people had access to food, access to water, because there were initial issues of panic buying and so on and so forth. But subsequently, as some of the fears that we had about what coronavirus was going to do to us, there were anxieties that people were going to be falling on the streets and dying. That didn't happen. The result, of course, was that we were tempted to become very relaxed. And I think everybody knows there were all kinds of myths as to what exactly was going on. The first person that was mentioned in relation to virus in Nigeria, people coming in, from trips abroad, and so very long time, and even up till now, ordinary people have a feeling that, well, this is something that only happens to either big people or those who are traveling abroad and so on. But the rest was quite fascinating, in part because it enabled us to use the existing structures of dialogue to reach Muslims. We did after our, we also took the trouble to reach out to, interestingly, an existing organization that holds some of the most vulnerable people together in Sokoto metropolis. They call themselves the Association of Beggars. We reached out to them both with money and also with food and so on. And a lot of this, there was a collective feeling of vulnerability, and it also offered people an opportunity to stand together. But of course, at the national level, the quality of the state was tested, in part because the bureaucracy has always been notoriously corrupt. So, of course, there were allegations here and there about whether or not people really took advantage of this, the distribution of what the word palliatives, became part of the lexicon for coping with COVID-19 in this structure. And they developed a democracy in many states. It developed a bureaucracy in many states. And this, of course, proved little bit complicated. Once you create a bureaucracy, service delivery becomes very difficult. So going forward, I think that this pandemic has given us an opportunity, one, to appreciate our collective vulnerability, but also the urgency of standing together. And we saw in very many situations, issues, cases of this solidarity. There was, of course, we had completed building a pastoral center with 30 rooms, 30-room accommodation here in Sokoto for the Diocese of Sokoto itself. And two quick developments. The first was waiver of our facilities to the Sokoto state government to say, look, we pray you may not need, but should the need arise, we are prepared to close business and make this facility available to the state government. Now Sokoto is almost 98 Muslims as a great surprise, but there was quite a lot of appreciation. The second also very spectacular development was the decision by the Catholic Bishops' Conference to make available 425 medical facilities, hospitals, clinics across the entire country. We made them available to the federal government and said to them, look, should you require any of these, we're more than happy to make them available. That has still remained the case up till now. So we've had wonderful opportunities to appreciate the need to stand together in solidarity, and to that extent, our ability to manage and hold together, blessing in disguise, in terms of coping with the challenges. And I think going forward, our hope is that we can build on our ability to stand together and to collaborate and cooperate with one another. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have a very rich set of experiences that have come, I don't even know if it was by design or by accident, from many different corners of the world. So let's move now to a second round. And in this, I think it's worth highlighting that almost all the members of this panel have been part of a continuing discussion that has gone with each of the regional events that have preceded the Interfaith Forum. And so in many respects, we have all been grappling with these questions, not only the questions overall, but in relation to the G20. In other words, what is it that we would like the G20 to do, but also how should religious communities be responding to these global agendas? So I hear three major themes, and I'll go back to each of you and you can pick up these. I think the first one, which was very much highlighted in the opening plenary today, is the ways in which governments and political organizations, I think we could also include business in that, are responding to the religious roles and the ways in crisis is affecting government religious relationships, whether it's freedom of religion or belief, or very practical issues of the authority of public health officials to respond in the pandemic. How is the COVID crisis affecting this? I think the second issue, which is a very strong preoccupation for almost all of us, I think it came out in every single one of the responses so far, is how do we translate the will to support the most vulnerable communities, whether it is women, children, whether it is refugees, whether it is beleaguered minorities. How does the energy and the experience and the wisdom, the traditions of religious communities, how do they engage with the broader community efforts to make sure that the vulnerabilities, the inequalities, the people left behind come into the agenda? And the third issue is specifically the management of new kinds, massive kinds of financial assistance, whether it's released by a debt standstill or whether it is new funds that are, as I mentioned, under discussion this week during the IMF World World Bank meetings. Broadly, I think Sarah Snyder highlighted that the corruption issue is a far more complex issue than it can appear on the surface. And one of the mysteries is that in the international integrity coalitions, for example, Transparency International, etc., religious voices and religious presence is often quite limited. So in other words, there is this massive global effort to address corruption, maybe not very effective, but the religious communities have not been an integral part of it. And it is worth remembering that it was not very long ago that a respectable economist position was that corruption was part of culture and it was grease for the motor, that it was something that needed to be accepted to a large extent, that it was part of human nature, part of the development trajectory. But I think more recently, there is a recognition that it causes rage and a failure of confidence, trust among populations all over the world. So it is fuel both for fundamentalists, for extremists on the right, but also extremists on the left. The explanation for race political leaders is often centered on corruption. So with those three sets of issues, the relationship between governments and religious bodies, with particular reference to the current emergencies, but how are they affecting the way things will change? Secondly, some of the practical issues, human rights, but also compassion and caring of reaching the most vulnerable. And then third, bringing these religious institutions, religious networks, interreligious and religious into this global effort to assure the kind of accountability for use of public resources for the future of responding, the effectiveness of response. So maybe, and as I mentioned earlier, many of us have been grappling with these issues through the regional events, but also through the brief on corruption issues and accountability, which has been prepared and which many of you have contributed to over the years. So let's go through each of you. I will let you pick which of these very broad issues you'd like to respond to. And perhaps we can start with Bishop Kuka, because I know you focused on these issues quite sharply in the Africa consultation. So perhaps you might start us off again. Bishop Kuka, did you hear me?
Unfortunately, he is disconnected, Professor. Or he's back.
Okay.
Let's see.
Bishop Kuka, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
No,
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, good. We're over to you.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Catherine, for that clarification. And also think that it's very important that you made the point about how religion has always been seen largely actually as a problem. And I think this is a throwback of how, during the Cold War, communism in particular, created the impression that religion was had no place in the public space. The result, of course, is that we see after 1989, gradually and grudgingly, many states now coming to terms with the fact that some of the assumptions that we had about religion were either not properly founded, or that the assumption that somehow the more prosperous people became, the less religious they were likely to be. So increasingly, governments are now coming back rather reluctantly nations to take religion very seriously. But I think the challenge there, of course, is that in the face of growing extremism on both sides, religion still remains very much the elephant in the room, and how to navigate it and to help it to serve the common good becomes the real issue. And this is where dialogue then becomes important, thing that I've been involved with myself for a very long period of time. But dialogue will only be effective only to the extent that governments do what governments are supposed to do. In many developing countries such as Nigeria, and most parts of Africa, and to some extent, Asia, it is not quite uncommon to see that state governors or presidents tend to see dialogue as a meeting between religious leaders from both faiths. And usually this is the easy part, that the bishops, the imams come together, we drink, we pat one another in the back, and we make declarations about how life really ought not to be as complicated as it is, and how we need to love one another and so on. But in reality, a lot of these conversations and moral exhortations have really almost no relationship with the realities that people experience, because religious identities become sharp in environments of scarcity. And very often, when you have presidents and governors and public administrators deliberately, clearly showing outright nepotism and favoritism to groups based on religion or based on gender or based on class, but for the purpose of religion, then it becomes complicated. In the last 5 years, this is one of the battles we've been fighting in Nigeria, where the Nigerian president has almost deliberately, very deliberately, skewed most of the key appointments in government, the entire security apparatus, and placed it in the hands of Muslims, and Muslims from northern Nigeria. That has created quite a lot of tension and anxiety. So, and of course, again, people see evidently that being in has to do with your religion and so on. So when you have this kind of situation, dialogue becomes extremely difficult. Management of resources and distribution of resources becomes very difficult when public officers don't play by the rules, and then they turn around and think that there is a religious problem. So of course, religion does always offer people an opportunity, to make certain claims. But what we call conflict between Christians and Muslims very often is conflict over the issue of who is in and who is out. So I think that going forward, the opportunity that we have now is for us to figure out the best ways of holding those in public office accountable. Beyond just talking about corruption, it is also, we need better in what is happening to minorities, because very often people forget that there may be majorities in one part of Nigeria or one part of Uganda or Kenya, but Muslims may be a majority or they may be a minority, but in other parts the situation is different. And very often what politicians tend to do is to pay back, let me put it that way. So the way when a president comes to power, a governor comes to power, to compensate his people, quote unquote, his people for the loss that they experience, or the marginalization that they experience. And this is what creates the tension in a country like Nigeria, and as I said, many parts of Africa, where ethnic differences already exist, and religious differences only serve to exacerbate some of those tensions. So going forward, I think that it is time that the conversation about fighting corruption should involve the churches. I think that anybody, reading the new encyclical by Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, that we're all brothers and sisters. This point is very eloquently made, about how to create a sense of dignity among citizens, and that in reality, very often corruption, we're thinking about people stealing money. But in reality, when politicians create environments that people don't feel a sense of belonging, whether because of agenda is very often a worse form of corruption. So I think that it is important to get the voices, religious voices, into these conversations, but in a way and manner that does not further compound the already difficult situations by people perceiving that Muslims are standing for Muslims, Christians are standing for Christians. But really, it is that we need to increase the moral tone of the conversation, in part because religion, in whatever shape or form, has always formed the moral basis for what the world now recognizes as law. So, indeed, it will be impossible for us to address the issues of human rights, the issues of compassion, the issue of our common citizenship, unless they are properly anchored in the moral foundation that each and every one of us is created in the likeness of God. Very often, what makes the conversation difficult is people see religion from the point of view of its organized form. And this is why there is need for greater openness in terms of people being free, to change their religion. It is guaranteed in the constitutions, but very often in northern Nigeria, where I live, for example, young Muslims or Muslims believe that if they want to change their religion, there is a threat that you might be killed, even though the constitution guarantees you freedom of movement, freedom of association. So we would like to see greater enforcement of the rights of man, especially as it relates to religion, because this is where people generally are hurting, that you are in an environment where you're not a majority, and participating, making your own contribution becomes serious. I think that if the table, if religion and religious leaders are placed on the table, but in a way and manner that still religious leaders still maintain their neutrality and still maintain a certain level of moral distance from the state, I think that the conversation will be much easier, because in many countries, ordinary people prefer to trust their religious leaders rather than the political class. Whereas the reality should be for us to encourage our people, to trust politics and to trust the political class, because, this is the way to go. But it will not happen if people don't feel a sense that politics and political systems are favorable and making it possible for them to attain the fullness of their lives.
You've made a lot of very important points that I certainly have lived and agree with. One of them is that in my experience, the dialogue between religious leaders and government and secular is often much more fraught and more difficult than dialogue among religious traditions, particularly if it comes down to basic positive principles. Let's turn to Ruth Messenger. Both Ruth and I are living at this point with the divisions in American society, and also with many very evident disparities by race, by gender issues, but also with the enormous, what would have been impossible to think about, mobilization of resources to respond to COVID, so little of it going to the international side. I leave it to you to figure out which of these challenges to pick up on.
Well, there's a lot to pick up on, Catherine, but I would like to suggest that the speech that the bishop just gave should be attached to the report on behalf of all of us. I mean, I think it was an eloquent balancing of all of these issues, an eloquent description of government, and frankly, of some of the evils of government. And I'm going to take, Bishop, with your permission, I'm going to take the phrase "improve the moral tone" and see if I can use it in my next 5 speeches. But seriously, I guess what I want to say is, we need to look, and I think Sarah did some of this, but what is the relationship been of faith-based institutions to governments all along? It's very often easy, or easier, as someone said, because of the fear of death, to not engage with the evils of government and to just decide that our faiths dictate that we need to take care of the people who are hurting. And that means increasing services, and it means maybe giving more services to the poor or those who are defined by gender or sexual orientation or whatever as being in more need. But we don't take the government to not treating every single person equally. And so now I don't like to say it this way because it's not like we didn't know this, but we have a dramatic example of what happens when you've neglected all of that and then something really goes awry. And so you have this fierce pandemic, and we don't have mechanisms, we don't have enough mechanisms for faith-based institutions to hold governments accountable. So the systemic inequities get exposed, and the faith-based institutions zero in even further. And Catherine, you're correct. There's a mobilization of resources, but I don't see that mobilization of resources either. First, I don't see the government implying them equitably. I'm just talking about the states now. They're not. But I also see that faith-based institutions have to deal with this difficult challenge, and it is very difficult when that is at the same time as we're trying to respond to a pandemic, trying to give people public health information, trying to help those who are hurting, trying to deal with really unbelievable levels of loss and depression and anxiety and anger and fill in the blanks. We also need to be saying to our governments, we need to essentially be the whistleblowers and say each of these governments could be doing more. We need to single out and maybe encourage the G20 to single out those few governments that seem to be responding fiercely to the pandemic and responding as equitably as possible, paying attention to the populations and being open and accountable with what they're doing. And I'm not sure I can think of examples of governments that are doing that. And I just want to say, as I say in every international meeting for the last 4 years, the United States is basically currently an example of how bad things can be. But I think that this, the notion of faith-based institutions wanting to, I would say, reinforce and strengthen each other in not retreating to our own universe or our own bubble and increasing our efforts to provide services and to provide care, but instead committing ourselves, committing our followers and adherents to advocacy, to being whistleblowers, to identifying inequities, to looking at the source, whether the source is, where everybody on this panel knows we're facing an election, to what we can do in the next, whatever it is, 20 days now to influence the election in this country, but much more broadly than that, what we can do as faith institutions to play our role in advocating for governments that are accountable. And yes, there are other actors leading these efforts, but we, at least on this call, have reason to believe that faith leaders directing their constituencies to hold their governments more accountable can have a big. I think that's really what your point was in convening this particular panel. Our job in the midst of the pandemic and, God willing, post the pandemic in finding ways to fight government corruption and hold governments accountable and rebuild trust between people and their governments are critical steps that we want to be taking as a very broad-based international interfaith community.
I think the point that you're highlighting sometimes is labeled speaking truth to power, but it's
yes,
also
I agree.
And that's very much what we're looking for. And we need to be aware that it's more difficult in some situations than others, where people's lives and livelihoods may be at stake in their relationship with governments. But it is what we look to religious leaders for, is this willingness to confront the real underlying issues. And we are seeing it in many ways in the pandemic. Let's go to Asia, to Mu. You highlighted the drama happening now in Thailand, but there are dramas happening in other countries in the region, some of which have religious dimensions, and this integrated blend of religious and non-religious, which I think is a feature of reality in so many parts of the world. How do you see, what do you want the G20 to do, and would you like the interreligious bodies? What would you like the Sangha? What is the action that can take us out of the current quagmire?
Well, I think every crisis is an opportunity. You see that after the Second World War, there's an international mechanism has been created, like the UN and others, that to help to support and so. But after the Second World War, there's the period of the nation building, which is that the government is become stronger. The after the colonization, and then the government have wealth and power and so on, and the government is also the nation state also is harm, even to the local community and weaken the local community as well as with the faith-based organizations in different countries. Someone said the religious group could be useful and harmful. The government, the same. The government also can be useful and harmful. I think that at this stage, also how we can build up, the I think it's the period that we're using this crisis to build back a stronger the local community, faith, local the community-based organization, and also the civil society at the local that ground up, and then that can be playing the role as a check and balancing mechanism with the government, as well as also could be collaborate with the government as well in certain issues. At the same time, also we need to build back the international mechanism. Like for example, I don't know whether with this during this crisis, how much the UN that we can be account to. No? A lot of things is go back to individual country that they are, just have bilateral or even they want to build that, get this and that for their country, their people, and so on and so forth. I think at this period, what I propose is the global institution also in the past is a build help to support financially and other things at the state level, at the government level. I think also the global institution also have to be considered, go down to the religious organization, go down to the community-based organization and the civil society that can be stronger, and then check and balance.
Let's go to Egypt. We haven't heard from Dr. Al-Rawa for a long time. You must have many reactions and ideas.
Thank you, Catherine. It's Saudi Arabia, not Egypt. Yeah. From what our colleagues have spoken and clearly pointed out, that the relation between religious leaders and governments, this relation has to be harmonized first. There should be a great relation, as the bishop mentioned, that sometimes the religious leaders' voices is heard more than the government, and the government is responsible to apply the constitutional rights and the national international commitments. Now, the relation between the leaders and the government, the religious leaders and the government, is really important to make sure that the society is not suffering of any inequalities or any discrimination, or there is some marginalized communities that whenever we face any crisis, economic crisis or health crisis like the one that we're having, we would find those groups are hardly hit, and then we find ways to support them and help them to survive. So the work on those issues within the country is possible that relation between government and religious leaders. Now, COVID-19 recognizes no borders, nor wealth, nor economic status. It's shown us that none is safe unless we are all safe. And because of the inequalities and discrimination, our societies are so fragile and threatened under any challenges. Now, religious leaders and religious actors should work on translating ethical values into concrete actions. This is by uniting with local and international education institutes, organizing and engaging with community development projects, reaching out and uniting with international organizations that work toward the implementation of human rights and making it a reality. Now, government transparency and accountability is crucial. It is important to know where mobilized money is going and how is it being spending, and nobody is left behind and everybody is involved. Now, engagement, dialogue, and communication among us to solve our differences is the solution to face any global crisis. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, if we don't solve our problems now, we will always have a huge challenge with every crisis. We have to identify the problems that we have within the country and work on them and not wait until it is too big to handle.
Let's go to Professor Machado and see how, from the European consultation, what do you see as the most important ideas and recommendations that we can take forward?
One idea that we also discussed was the importance of interreligious dialogue, and not just interreligious, but religious and secular dialogue more than ever. You know, as you know, there is no moral consensus on human rights. There are many issues concerning human rights that are disputed, that are controversial, including abortion, family, reproduction, euthanasia, and things like that. So these are really very complex questions that require continuous dialogue and engagement. And as we can see, and for instance, also migration and things like that. And as we can see, there is this hyper polarization and politicization when it comes to these topics. We see the social networks with all kinds of hate speech, anti-migrant speech, populist speech, fake news about all these topics, including COVID-19, all kinds of conspiracy theories. And we see that, because there is no dialogue, there is no compromise, there is no willingness to engage in serious and rational discussion, we see that, the different groups in society, they want to control the Congress, they want to control the executive, they want to control the courts, they want to control the members of the court, they want to control the United Nations Human Rights Council. And so we have this, for instance, yesterday, China, Russia, Cuba, and so on were elected for the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. We see that in all these fields, there is really an atmosphere, a toxic atmosphere that should be addressed. And it seems to me that religious communities, and in the spirit, for instance, of this, the already mentioned encyclical of Tutti Fratelli, this was really an attempt to bring in some rationality, some reasonableness, some serenity to this debate. And I think it's very important that religious communities understand a role to play, without denying their own identity, their own beliefs, but agreeing to disagree, but really seeking common ground, because religious communities have a common ground, a common commitment to truth, to dignity, to justice, to solidarity, and to peace. And so they, based on these fundamental values, they should be able really to address this toxic climate that is dominant and that is really contaminating the politics in many countries, as we see now. For instance, right now in the United States, the confirmation of this new U.S. Supreme Court justice, but we also see the same thing, for instance, in Brazil. This dispute of the ministers that will go, the justices that will go to the Supreme Court, because there is a extreme polarization, and we need really democratic, reasonable compromise. We need also freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but not just that, but the regulation of media in terms of addressing fake news, addressing hate speech, because we see that, unfortunately, even in those countries like the United States or that traditionally were the beacons of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, we see the populist discourse taking over the airwaves and taking over the social networks and spreading throughout the world. So we need really the engagement, the critical engagement, and the dialogic engagement of interfaith dialogue. And that's why this initiative of interfaith dialogue, the G20 interfaith dialogue, is so important, so timely. It's really an opportunity to change the course of events throughout the world. And so I think this should be really a priority. Otherwise, people will really start neglecting human rights, saying that it's all about harassing the different countries. It's all about trying to impose a kind of absolutistic ideology. Trying to impose a kind of global elitism or something like that. No, it's not about that. It's really about caring for the most vulnerable in society and trying to really sow the seeds of justice so that we can reap peace. Because if we take peace seriously, we should take justice seriously.
Dealing with the pollution in the world is certainly the leading challenge, and we have great hope from the best in religion. Let's turn to Sarah Snyder. How do you see these challenges, and what would you like to see the G20 do, or one of the concepts behind the G20 Interfaith is that it brings together a network of networks of so many, and I think you are, as many of us, part of many of these networks. So what is your call to action?
Thanks, Catherine. One of the things I was thinking about, as I was listening to my colleagues speak, is that in some parts of the world, senior government officials are, of course, religious actors. So they are influenced by their religious leaders. And so religious leaders in those contexts have a huge potential role to play in terms of accountability, being able to speak truth to power in ways that in other parts of the world that can't happen from religious leaders. So I think that's an interesting role. I've seen that very much played out, for example, in South Sudan, where Pope Francis and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church and the Archbishop of Canterbury were able to speak to the most senior levels of political leadership because they represented the traditions from which those political leaders were from. In other parts of the world, though, where our government leaders are often, and our multinational leaders, including many of the UN organizations, have a secular worldview. There is this sense that religious leaders feel excluded or don't come into the spaces that are opened up by those kinds of meetings. That there is this sense, if you like, that the secular worldview is somehow an umbrella that sits over all the religious worldviews, and that somehow the religious worldviews can't be, they don't know how to be neutral, whereas the secular worldview is, of course, neutral. Well, that's just not true, is it? The secular worldview is a worldview alongside all the religious worldviews. So perhaps a message I would love to give is, how can we open spaces at the most senior levels in which religious leaders feel fully welcome, in which the secular voice is just one of many, and there is a diversity, a plurality of religious voices that are represented. That kind of space I really see in those platforms. And then the final thought I just wanted to throw in is to your middle question, Catherine, about how do we reach the most vulnerable communities. And I just want to challenge us to think about when vulnerable communities, including women the world over, but also including others like refugees, are themselves the first responders and the primary caregivers. In our nearest city, Carlisle, the food bank that's opened up to support the most vulnerable families is in fact run by the refugee group. So they themselves have become the caregivers and providers. So perhaps we shouldn't always think of the vulnerable groups as those we need to reach, but recognize that our vulnerable groups can also be those who are opening the right capacities to help others.
Wonderful. We have about a half hour, just over a half hour, and we have a variety of questions that are coming in. I'm actually going to read one before I turn to Juan Navarro Floria for his reactions. But this is one that's an admonition, I think, to all of us for both concrete ideas, but also for hope. Listening to these views makes me despair for the future. Do any of the speakers have any concrete ideas that can be implemented? So I think that's a challenge. But meanwhile, Juan, you've been part of the G20 Interfaith Forum, I think even longer than I have. How do you see some of these questions, which I think in many ways have been there from the very beginning, but they've taken on a new dimension, a new urgency, new interlinkages now during this period of the COVID crisis?
Yes, I see. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, there are many very important ideas in the previous. I would like to go back to the issue of the corruption that you asked before, because in a Latin American perspective, this is a very important issue because corruption is very present in our countries, sadly, but it is real. And I think that the presence of religions in the, for instance, social aid in the crisis of the COVID crisis, not guarantee to avoid corruption. Of course, I think that Jonathan said before that religions need to be aware to avoid corruption themselves inside themselves, and this is. But if we look in average, I would say the religions are much. It is much more important in the states than in the religious world. So I think that this for this issue, the presence of religion is very important in this moment. I think that one tool for this is to have some kind of advisory council or something like this, where the religious voices heard by the state and the officers of the government. Many years ago, I had the experience being part of the government of my country. We create an advisory council with people from relevant people from religious traditions, and was a wonderful experience. When I underline the need of dialogue has very different levels. The dialogue is needed between the religions, and we have of dialogue here in Latin America. It's a very, very, very good experience of interreligious and ecumenical dialogue. There are another level is the dialogue between the religions and the state, and this is something that to work maybe not because the state has to encourage the dialogue between the religions, because this but with the state. Of course, the place for the discussion of politics is the Congress. This is the natural place to discuss the public politics. But there are other instances for dialogue could be useful, I think, because regarding this emergency now, the COVID crisis, the presence of the religious voices can make evident that the health is not only the health of the body, but we need to have in mind the health, including the spiritual needs, and this is very important. I think that G20, and I go into your question, Catherine, about this process. I think that the G20 must sit at the table, the religious actors too, because they have. We have experienced that the religious sectors are important in society, and this is why to put this Interfaith Forum as a formal part of the G20 process, because religions have something important to say. And one of the things that this crisis evident is the rise of nationalism and the particular, and the religions can provide the main religion, the big religions in the world, can provide a worldwide perspective when nationalism is because they have in mind this idea of the universal human dignity. Many has reminded these days the last encyclical of Pope Francis about and human fraternity, and this is not something strange, because religion make conscience of the people about the common human dignity. I think that this, like Laudato Si, Pope Francis was a very present document in the past meetings of G20, Interfaith G20, because the importance of the environmental issues, that is, of course, they are important, but now this other document and the precedent document between the Islamic leaders, I think that they are is liked for the future of our discussions.
Thank you very much. And one thing I think we should recognize, I think each one of us knows, is that everyone who's on this panel is here because you are so deeply and actively involved in addressing these issues and struggling with their complexities. Each one of us, each one of you has a long history of remarkable courage and creativity in addressing these issues. Let's go to some of the other questions. I think the final question, which I read before, was essentially, what are we going to do about the difficult challenges that face the world? But here's one. I think maybe it should go to Sarah and to Mu. And it's an interesting question. Some public statements have been heard from religious leaders interpreting COVID-19 as God's punishment of humanity. And the question is really, how does this influence this challenge that we have of assuring that religious voices are at the table? Because as we often say, if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. And it is the sort of core challenge of the G20 Interfaith is to bring the best side, the wisdom of religious traditions, but also their experience to these policy tables, and in this case, the G20. But maybe Sarah and then Mu, fatalism, this question of religious, and it turns sometimes around faith versus science. And as we all know, it's a tiny, I would say tiny, we don't really know, minority of religious actors who reject the science, etc. But they are very vocal and they are very visible. So how do we respond to that challenge from one of our questioners?
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, the first thing I would say is that the most important way to challenge either views or the views of those who sincerely believe that the pandemic, for example, is a punishment from God in ways that might be unhelpful for wider society, is to bring them into dialogue and collaboration with other communities who think differently. It's this idea of by bringing these different voices together, by being able to disagree well, if you like, in a shared environment, some of the assumptions and prejudices of particular communities will be exposed to other broader thinking and may be challenged in some ways. The point is not to undermine different perspectives, but just to bring them into dialogue and play with one another. And I think the more we can do that, rather than exclude those either marginalized or isolated voices, the healthier it is for all of our societies.
Mu, clearly Buddhism has at least the reputation of an element of fatalism. Is this something you're hearing, and how do you think we should be responding?
Well, with the issue, with the crisis, when the Thailand, we are the first country who got the case of the COVID outside China. And then the Supreme Patriarch of the Buddhist Sangha in Thailand, 1 month after he came and he issued a letter for 42,000 Buddhist temple in Thailand to open up their kitchen to serve to the people. That kind of thing is give the signal for the Buddhist community in Thailand that also to support to the people. That's why a lot of for the poor community or even the support the marks to the people and so on and so forth. This kind of thing with that kind of distribution. That's why we, in some way, we can lower the case until now. And also among the Buddhist community in the region, also they have the network, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, even in China, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. This kind of thing also is a kind of build up the network, using the network that already established to distribute the information, correct information. In the itself, with technology, the monk also using Zoom and others to give the social support to the local community, and even they doing the Buddhist chanting through the Zoom and so on and so forth. This kind of thing is spreading in this also like in the country and in the region.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very much the sense I have, is that a lot of the religious leaders are eminently practical in their response, and living in the present as well as living in the future. And the wisdom and the experience they bring is what we're trying so hard to tap into. Bishop Kuka, the next question is very much focused on Africa, so others may want to jump in. But it is dealing with one of the challenges that Africa may not have suffered the impact of COVID as much as other parts, but the focus has often been on the parallel pandemics, but with concern that HIV and malaria have really been abandoned in many families who are dependent on the informal market have lost their livelihoods. So it's been a social disease, empowering people in many countries. So as you said, this is the question, as Bishop Kuka said, corruption has also skyrocketed. The poor and vulnerable are now poorer and more vulnerable. What needs to change in the global economic model? Are you prepared to take on that big question?
Thank you very much, Kathleen. But if I may just make a quick point in terms of, just to deal with the issues of the creeping despair, that we have that Saudi Arabia is involved in this conversation, the very fact that KAICIID exists, and that we are hearing the Holy Father quoting the Grand Imam of Mecca, Ahmad Al-Taib, is a significant development on the way forward. So there's a lot of hope about what religion and its capacity to do good can achieve. And gradually, if the fear and anxiety can begin to go down, we'll be making tremendous progress. I really would have looked forward to this meeting taking place in Saudi Arabia. That would be a spectacular development. So I think, those are some of that's part of the good news. The point you make, of course, it is the case that there have been different interpretations, most of them hardly scientific. But I think also that one of the gracious things about this pandemic is that we here in Africa, you hear people say, well, God's umbrella of mercy has been hovering over us because God knows that left on our own, we will not even be able to cope anyway. And that more importantly, the very fact that this disease has started where it has started means that a greater struggle, greater intensity of effort that will be made to find a cure. But the other issue about what is happening to other areas of our lives, yes, this is quite true. In a place like Nigeria, for example, where the crisis is not even about the pandemic, but it is about another horrible pandemic, that is the crisis, the killings by Islamic fanatics under Boko Haram, and the amount of people that have lost their lives running into tens of thousands. This is a matter of great concern. The result is that many farmers, the rains were wonderful this year, but a good number of farmers were not able to go to their farms because of fear. So Africa has this massive basket of cases and problems. I think that perhaps going forward, one of the things that I would like to see, the G20 deal with very practically is the whole issue of retaining stolen monies that are in Europe, and specifically tying them down to poverty alleviations. A simple example, I think the Nigerian government has received about $300 million back, purported to have been part of the money that was stolen by our late dictator, General Abacha. But it was also significant that I think the French, they insisted that the money would be returned, but they require evidence that the money is going to be committed to dealing with the problems of ordinary people. So I think that on a practical level, that step can help to mitigate, the crisis that a lot of people face in Africa. That if we know about the illicit flow of huge amount of resources out of Africa, and that if you can fast track the of them, they will help to alleviate the excesses that COVID-19 has inflicted on many communities. And then, of course, help to address some of the problems that still persist, namely very poor health infrastructure that exists on the ground right across the continent. Thank you very much.
And did you want to tackle the economic models, which the questioner is asking? What's the way to approach that? I mean, clearly Pope Francis in many ways is looking for a fairer economic model that moves away from too much dependence on consumption and more on common effort. But is this one that you want to tackle?
This conversation, but I think also there's very little that the Holy Father can say. I think that one of the difficulties that Africa faces has to be a question of producing what they consume and avoid consuming what they do not produce. The African elites, and it's also very interesting that the Holy Father addresses this question in his new encyclical. It is a problem that was, that has always run through his messages. But most critical is that African leaders have developed a taste that they cannot sustain, and this taste from cars to marmalade to cheese has to do with that. To make humongous resources are being committed to importing things that most African countries do not need. So I think that we need to see a deliberate effort at fast-tracking the effort towards agriculture and agricultural inputs and so on. Most African countries will be able to feed them. For that to happen, as I said, African governments must be encouraged to move away, to focus very, very much on producing what they can, producing what they consume as opposed to consuming what they do not produce. And secondly, we'd like to see greater commitment to development of infrastructure, such as railways, and so on, in order to enable Africans communicate with themselves in a much more effective and efficient manner. Most of us are familiar with Europe and America and hardly know anything about, the countries next to us, to help communication in Africa.
I'm inclined to agree with you that a lot of the kinds of changes that are needed can take place at the national as well as the global level, and they come back to the basic question of what is the purpose of government and how is it serving its citizens. There are two more questions and 15 minutes or 13 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is read the questions and then give each of you, in the order that we started with, what will probably 1 minute for any kind of final wisdom or comment. So question 3 is, based on the current experience, what are the directions of future plans that religious and civil actors are working on in facing such challenges in the future? I read you the question about the despair, but the last one is, trust in political leaders is essential, which means holding to the rules, transparency, and the ability to hold them to account. Alongside this needs to be the practical care for the most vulnerable. If the concern is about economic viability, the poorest in the nation need to have access to food, stable homes, and decent health care. Shouldn't the religious leaders be the conscience of the nation? So let's start with Dr. Al-Hawa.
Yes, I agree that religious leaders should be the conscience of the societies and the communities. And I would also like to go back to a question where you asked about, or was asked about, that COVID-19 is a punishment or a punishment from God. I realized reading a lot of reports that a lot of communities or minorities or marginalized communities, because of the suffering they have and because of the lack of understanding of what's going on and not having a dialogue of how things going part, and the voices are not being heard and not being part of the decision making and the process the government is taking to prevent or to eliminate this disease. Therefore, they look for explanations that they are able to understand, to explain to themselves what's going on. And unfortunately, they accept these explanations. Now, my point of view is I believe that religious leaders and religious actors have a major role in reaching out to those groups and also pointing out and raising the flag when there are vulnerable people or vulnerable groups that needs to be looked at and helped before there is a huge impact on them. Then the governments will not be able to tolerate all this pressure and will not be able to help them the way they should help.
Thank you, Dr. Rama. I think Mu, you're next.
Okay. I think the religious leader should be the loom to weave all the community level, national level, and international level come together. Is to weaving of this and to strengthen the community that is weakened by the rising of nation state, and also to bring the international level into the ground on the community level. These three levels should be support, and just leader can play that role.
Ruth? Unmute.
Yeah, sorry. So I don't want to overdo this because I'm well aware, and you said eloquently, Catherine, that it's a huge issue in many different faiths and countries to take this role. But I do want to say that people who wrote in or questioned, like, this is all hopeless, that's actually our job. Our job, however we define it, faith by faith, is to have a vision of a world that is more just, to, again, as the bishop said, improve the moral tone. And we are the people in our faith communities that can make it, that can give some people a greater sense of hope, and be very practical about what they can do about it. It's, every religion is full of activities that its followers need to pursue, from prayer to ritual to holiday celebration, to activism. And so when you say, like, what is it that people can do? I've spent a lot of time in the last several months explaining to faith communities, and my faith, but other faith leaders, that voting is, telling people who to vote for is a partisan activity and not allowed under the U.S. law. Telling people to vote is a political activity which is allowed under the U.S. tax law. And if you want to know the first thing to do right now in this particular country to get a government that is more accountable and trustworthy and will be our partner, or will let us be their partner in improving systemic inequities, then that's one thing to do. But in every country, it's not just voting in the U.S. election. In every country and with every faith, I think the notion is there is a better world coming. That's a Christian hymn, but it doesn't come by itself, and there are things we can do to make our governments, to advocate to our governments to take steps toward greater accountability. I'm not advocating that anyone take steps in their country that runs the risk of death, although American Jewish World Service supports a lot of leaders around the world who do, in fact, risk death in order to assert the human rights of themselves and their communities. But far short of doing something that's quite that far out, there are ways to urge people to participate in the earthly world as well as in the spiritual world, and to give them concrete and specific steps that can be taken. It's as simple. People talked earlier and on the early panel about COVID services that are being given out in a discriminatory death. But governments, local governments, can be pressured to give out resources and services that they have for people who are sick and dying in a more equitable way. So I can't begin to imagine the steps for any of the people on this panel or any of the people attending the conference. But I think for the G20 to be urged, both for their governments to be more accountable and trustworthy, and to partner with local faith institutions to work collaboratively in taking steps to improve their societies, is at least something I'd like to see us recommend. And that doesn't even get to the bottom line issue of corruption, which you asked about earlier, and which ought to be an ongoing concern of ours as well. It's been a great...
Sorry, I cut you off. Yonatas.
You know, coming to the going to the question of despair. When I listen to you, Catherine, and to all the other panel members, I have no sense of despair whatsoever. On the contrary, I must say that I am very encouraged. Of course, we know that there are no magic bullets. You know, this is a chess game, a complex chess game in which we are now articulating the different moves of the different pieces. And of course, concrete proposals have already been made in the different regions of the world. They would be submitted to the G. And so something really important is happening. And as it was pointed out, the simple fact that G20 Interfaith is taking place in Saudi Arabia, it's really a feat. It's a remarkable victory already. It's a victory of a global civil society, of religious dialogue, secular dialogue, of the awareness that we need multilateralism, we need human rights, and we need most probably also what we in Europe call a social market economy. A social market economy is the economy that recognizes that it's important for the markets to function, you know, for there to be private property, you know, economic initiative, but also, you know, and so we don't need a centralized economy, planned economy as it used to be in the old communist countries, but it's an economy that also recognizes that there are some non-economic values such as the environment, consumers' rights, workers' rights, health, and educational rights and interests that must be protected. So the choice is not between capitalism or communism, as some politicians like to frame it. It's not an all or nothing choice. We have more, you know, there are different shades in this economic models thing, and we can really strive for a functioning economy, but in which social rights, fundamental non-economic values and interests are protected, because it's important for the workers to be protected, consumers, the environment, and the most vulnerable need also protection. So I am encouraged with this.
We only have 1 minute for the last three, so let's give you each. I don't want to deprive you of the minute. So let's go to Juan first, and then Bishop, and then Sarah. Juan, 1 minute. Mute. Can't hear you.
No, excuse me. 1 minute. This pandemic shows that something very important. That is, the life is fragile. Life is fragile, and the current society maybe don't like to see this, but all of us we are going to do the death corner, and the religions has a very important role, is to put some kind of hope the people of sense for these lives. And this is, I think, that this emergency put the role of the religions face to face to all of us. This is only one idea to finish this participation.
Bishop, I know it's cruel to give you 1 minute, but you've said a lot already that we have to chew on. Bishop Kuka.
Bishop, please unmute your microphone.
Sorry, thank you very much. Just to make the point that given the global realities, that increasingly, without being insular, more and more communities should begin to develop the mechanisms on the ground for resolving their problems, so that we don't become hostages to globalization. And that the younger generation of citizens pull back from seeking comfort outside their immediate environments, the greater the opportunity that we have, that we can really make these journeys together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
Just to say that as religious actors and leaders, we are embedded within our communities for the long term. And that's unlike many of our political leaders who are in and out in the short term. So we really are bearers of hope with that long-term vision that we need to bring us.
Well, let me not try to summarize. We'll have time to do that, but I want to thank each of you warmly. I want to emphasize again the important work that each one of you is doing and the respect that I have for your wisdom and for your voices, but also thank you for your courage in taking on these issues here today. And I think this is not the end. I think it's Winston Churchill who said that it's not the end, it's not the beginning, but it's the end of the beginning or the beginning of the path to the end. We have a long way to go in trying to address these issues, and I hope we can do it together. And I do encourage anyone to try to comment on the draft brief as well as on the outcomes of the regional meetings so that we have the most persuasive material, the most persuasive ideas as we present them to the G20 leaders who will be meeting next month. So farewell and see you, I guess, tomorrow morning, most of you. And thank you again. My warm thanks to all of you.